Good afternoon. So I'm arguing with this fellow on Facebook, and he's a Muslim guy, and he's just verified all the things that I believe and have came to conclude through all my research on the Bible, and why all these people over time try to purify the Bible, going in the wrong direction. I've made so many videos on this, and now that I'm encountering Muslims, it's all panning out to be true. And what I'm going to tell you is, what happened with the Bible is that people tried to purify it. You had with the Protestant movement and with these various religious movements of people trying to purify the Bible. In fact, deism of the Freemasons and the deists was an attempt to purify the religion. And so you have people trying to purify the religion. Islam is an attempt to purify the religion of the Bible. And it's really the most corrupted form of this attempt at purifying it. Now, the reason why it's so corrupt is because all the things that they didn't like about the Bible, they simply said, well, we're changing this story, we're changing that story. They didn't just make up a new story. They said, no, all these old stories were wrong, and this is how it should be. In other words, it wasn't perfect enough for them. And this is the thing about the Bible that you have to understand if you want to understand why it was written, how it was written, is that it was not written to be perfect. The Bible is the writings of the Aramaic people. Okay, it's their writings. It was written by people. It was written by men. It was not written by God. It was their understanding and their stories about God. So they're trying to teach people about God through their stories. They're trying to. Then there's certain prophets who did come around, like Isaiah, who spoke about the people of Israel and how they should go away from evil and come back to goodness and follow the God who is being defined by Isaiah at that time as a God of righteousness and justice. It's a complicated story. But what the Muslims did was they just changed the books, like they just changed all the stories to make it fit what they thought it should be. Okay? It's not what you think it should be. It's not what anyone thinks it should be. It just is what it is. The Bible is what it is. Okay? The Bible is not... So here's the other thing. The Muslims go on and on about how the Bible was corrupted, and it was corrupted by man, and so now the Muslims had to come and fix it. This is not the case. This is not the case. The Bible that we have, let's just take here's the thing. The Bible there are many books in the Bible. Okay, there's many books in the Bible. And you could say, well, this passage contradicts that passage, and this contradicts this passage, because there's many different authors of the Bible. The Bible wasn't written by one person. The Bible was written by many people over thousands of years. That's how it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be this perfect book that was written by one person. Now, but you're saying, well, but if there was one God who invented all this, he would have had it all laid out perfectly. But that's not what happened. And that's not how this religion came about. Genesis, for instance, done videos on this. Genesis, when you're reading Genesis, you're not reading a book about monotheism. You're reading a book that came from the Anunnaki. The God described in Genesis is the leader of the Anunnaki. And the leader of the Anunnaki means he's the leader of these other gods who are actually the elements, that represent the elements. And he was known as Enlil, mainly. There were some other territories that put... Anu above Enlil as the supreme deity. But Enlil was generally known as the supreme deity who commanded all the other elements, all the other natural phenomena. So when we think of gods, we go, what do you mean gods? Well, we mean water, wind, rain, the earth, the agricultural phenomena. These were the gods of the old world. And so when the religion changed, when the Israelites came into this new religion, first, it was their tribal god. They were trying to get away from Egypt. God, I'm skipping around here. You have to understand what happened. Let me put it to you this way, and I've said this in other videos. When you try to purify the religion, okay, it doesn't purify into one god. It purifies into many gods. because that's where it came from. It came from many gods, and it became monotheistic. Okay, it started out as many gods, and it became monotheistic. So its base, its origin, is polytheism. The origin of monotheism is polytheism. What they did with monotheism is they said, rather than worshiping all these other gods, we're only worshiping the creator God. Because if you look at, for instance, the Egyptian genealogy, okay, so you'll have in the Egyptian genealogy, you'll have a creator God who then materializes as the sun and the water and the mist and the air and the sky. And in other words, this one God creates all these other gods. So it's really one God manifesting as all these different natural phenomena in the universe. Okay, and it all traces back to the creator, right? He creates this, and he basically thinks it into existence. That's where we get into thought, the dimension of thought being the creative force in the universe, and it is. And there's truth to that. However, it's not just because it was written out that way doesn't mean that's exactly how it is. That's a description, a symbolic description of how the universe came into existence. So what I'm telling you is the people that try and say, the Muslims who are saying we've perfected the religion, it's all perfect in our book. It might be perfect to you. It might even make more sense or be better. You could say, well, this version of the story of David is better, and this version of the story of Aaron is better than the original. But that's it. That's the whole point. Your story is not the original. The story in the Bible is the original story. And maybe it's not perfect, and maybe it's not good enough for you. But that's the original story. You see what I mean? That's the original story. And it came about by people writing these stories down. It didn't come about by God sitting there and dictating stories to people. That's not, if you think that's what God is, you're worshiping a false God. If you think God sits around dictating stories to people, you are worshiping a false God. That's not what God is. It's not at all what God is. Okay? These stories were written by men. The Bible is a book of stories written by men, fictional stories that parallel real history. So there's like these parallels of things that really happened, and then they're fictionalized accounts. So there's a mixture of, the Bible's a mixture of historical events with fiction and with philosophy, all mixed together. So it's not going to be perfect, and it's by many different authors over thousands of years. And the books were written at different times throughout those years. Now, we have the original 5 books of Moses. We have that. It hasn't changed because we have the Greek version, and we have the Aramaic version. So the Aramaean people, that was the race that the Jews came from. That was the race that the Israelites came from. They came from the Aramaean people. Those Aramaic people went into Egypt. And when they were in Egypt, they first adopted the Egyptian gods. And then hundreds of years later, because no one viewed them as Egyptian ever, they were never looked upon as being Egyptians, they said, well, we need our own God. That's what happened. They said, well, if we're not going to be part of your society, you won't let us be Egyptians, then we need our own God. And that's why they had their tribal God. They took on this new tribal God. This God didn't exist in the rest of Canaan. It came out of Egypt. See, all this stuff is stuff Muslims know nothing about. This is how the story came about. It didn't start out with... like I said, Genesis is not a story of one God. It says, let us, the God speaking in Genesis says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. He's speaking to other gods in Genesis because it comes from Enuma Elish is where it comes from. And that's why in Genesis it says that Adam and Eve were hiding from the God, and he appears at the breeze of the day. In the King James Version, it says at the cool time of the day. In the literal translation, it says he comes at the breezy time of the day. The breezy time, because Enlil is the god of the breeze and the wind. and the god of the storm, which is why in Canaan he's known as Baal. But what happened with Baal was they were worshiping him as a statue, which was against the religion of this new religion of the Israelites. It was a tribal religion, and it wasn't. It was a tribal god. It was a war god. It was a god of conquest. It wasn't until later. It wasn't until after some time. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where it was. I would say after the Hezekiah period, or around that time, where you get prophets like Isaiah who start to say that God is a God of justice, and God is a God of righteousness, and God is a God of virtue. And you have to be virtuous, and you have to be just, and you have to be righteous. That's how it came to be defined. It didn't start out that way. And you're like, what about Adam and Noah and Abraham? Those stories were all written later. There was a legend of somebody coming from Mesopotamia. There was a legend of that, because that legend is known in the Hebrew Bible as Abraham, and he's known to the Persians as Zoroaster. Now, I believe, after having looked at this for some time, that the Persians got the idea from the Jews after they had encountered the Jews. And then that's when they started having this idea that Zoroaster existed. But if you look at the Zoroastrian religion, it's not just one god. There's other deities, and there's other spirits and all this kind of stuff. Here's the point. The Muslims invented a new stories because they didn't like the original ones. They thought they weren't good enough. They weren't. They didn't portray certain people in the Bible the way that the Muslims felt that they should be portrayed. So they just changed the stories, and they said this came from God. They're lying. It didn't come from God. It came from them, because they didn't like the original story, so they invented their own stories. Much the same way that Paul invented his stories of Jesus, right? The Muslims constantly bitch about Paul and complain about Paul did this and Paul did that. Paul is a very small figure. He's a big figure in Christianity. He's a very small figure in the Bible. And Paul's influence in the Bible is actually not very significant. It's significant only to Christianity, later Christianity. So Paul changed some of the stories of Jesus, and the Muslims changed even more stories. They're doing the same criminal types of perverse corruptions to the Bible that Paul did. And they're doing it even more, because Paul's only talking about one person in the story, which is Jesus. And so the moral of this, here's the other thing. Jesus is not a real person. Just like Noah wasn't a real person. Just like Adam and Eve weren't real people. Just like there's a lot of characters in the Bible that are fictional. Jonas didn't really live in a whale's belly for 3 days. Okay, he didn't. It's not true. It's not a true story. Esther is not really a Jewish princess. That's the planet Venus. The Jews wrote stories. They wrote fictional stories about. A lot of times they would write fictional stories because there were other gods that were popular. Okay, Ishtar was popular. Well, they turned her into a Jewish princess. Marduk was popular. They turned Marduk into Ishtar's or Esther's uncle or relative. You see what I mean? So that's what they did, and that's what they did with the Egyptian gods. They turned Atum into Adam. They turned the gods into men. They turned the gods of the Gentiles into men and women in their stories. That's what they did. So the moral of this whole story is you don't purify the religion by thinking that there was one God somewhere that dictated stories to people. That is a lie. That's a false God. The real way it actually happened was that you had polytheism. You had a rejection of the gods of Egypt by a certain group of people that were in Egypt because they weren't Egyptian. And they wanted to have their own religion. They wanted to have their own God. They based their new religion, much of it, on Egypt, which is why you see Jews walking around with their side locks. Of course, they're not wearing them correctly, but they have a bad interpretation of some of these old religious books that they got from the priest class of Egypt. So they took stuff from Egypt, and then they had their own cultural stuff from Mesopotamia with Enuma Elish and the story of the flood, of Zia Sudra. Okay, Zia Sudra, also known as Astrahasis, also known as Utnapishtim, also known as Noah. Okay, so there's a lot of fiction mixed with parallels of real history, mixed with philosophy, and you're going to find contradictions in the Bible. You're going to find all the works of man in the Bible. You're going to find man's attempts to understand God in the Bible, and it's not perfect, and it will never be perfect because it was never meant to be perfect. It's just a book that men came up with, and it's quite an astonishing book. But the Muslims tried to rewrite it and tried to say that theirs was the real copy that was dictated to them by their false God that doesn't exist, because that's not what God is. God does not dictate books to people. Paul, as well, invented a fake version of Christianity because there was no Jesus the man. Jesus the man didn't exist, because Muslim will hear, oh, he said Paul was fake Christianity because he knows that Jesus was really a prophet. No, Jesus was not a prophet. Jesus was not a human. Jesus was a fictional character that symbolized the light of God. It's a story. It's a story. It's a story. Jews wrote stories. That's what they do. They write stories. It's not real. Jesus was not a person who walked around and did all these miracles. It's a story. It's a story about the truth. It's a story about the light of God. And these people in Israel were having arguments amongst one another about what the religion was supposed to be, and then they had the Jesus story has parallels also to the dying and resurrecting gods, because that was popular among the Canaanites, right? And so rather than having their own people leave these religions, they turned Tammuz into a Jewish god. They kosherized it, is what they did. That's what they did with Esther and Marduk. Esther and Mordecai, Ishtar and Marduk. They kosherized it by taking a Gentile god and making it into a Jewish character. It's no longer a god, right? But in the case of Jesus, he's the Son of God, he's the light, he's the truth, he's the resurrection of nature, he's symbolizing all these things. What he wasn't, in reality, is a man. That's why Islam is fake. Because they're saying, oh, well, he was a prophet. No, he wasn't a prophet. He's a character in a fictional story about God, about the light, about the resurrection of nature at springtime, which was the New Year celebration at that time. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. But basically, I'm going to repeat it one more time for this video. Is you don't purify this religion by becoming more by suggesting that there was a monotheism that got corrupted by polytheism. That's not what happened. You had polytheism was rejected by people in Egypt by a group of Aramaic people who came up with their own god, and then this god that was created by them for their tribal god, which now there is a creator of the universe that we're all part of. So there's truth to some of the philosophy, is that there is a creator of the universe. Okay, I'm not saying that there isn't, but it's not what you think it is if you're a Muslim. It's not what you think it is necessarily either if you're a Jewish or a Christian that has this false understanding. The creator of this universe is the dimension of thought. It's not some guy somewhere. It's a dimension of thought that we're all collectively part of. And you can see some of my other videos, but this universe is a collective dimension of thought. It's the space around you is the mind. It is the mind, and the universe is a physical, mechanical representation of thought. It's a mechanical, physical representation of thought. That's what space is. That's what matter is. That's what you're in, is a physical. You're looking around at this universe. It's a physical, mechanical representation or symbol of thought, and that's all it is. That's what space is. That's what energy is. And so there's a dimension of thought, and that's what's creating this. So that's the creator. That's the creator dimension. It's not some guy that dictates little stories to you, but it is associated with natural law and the divine law of your conscience, doing righteousness, doing virtue. That's why in Christianity and in the Old Testament we knew who was the follower of God, the Creator, by whether or not they were virtuous, whether or not they did righteousness, whether or not they were true and honest, and these were the qualities that that is said in the prophets of Israel and in Christianity. That's how we know who is a follower of God and who isn't, and that's how we know. Anyway, that's about all I'm going to say on the subject for now. Have a good one.